So, hello everybody. I'm Tom Bridge. I'm a partner at Technolutionary in Washington, D.C. We're an Apple Consultants Network member, and we serve small and medium-sized businesses. Our target market is someplace between 10 and 200. How many people here work for institutions much larger than that? A lot of hands go up. So, again, some of the assumptions that I'm making are that you're, one, setting up Munki more than once. Two, that maybe you're serving multiple different clients along the way. And so all of this advice, some of this early advice may be quite obvious to people. However, they are still mistakes that I've made that other people may benefit from. We're 5 or 6 years into Munki at this point. It's a mature platform. Munki 3 was released back in May. At MacDevOps, they got to push the button that hit commit in front of a live audience. It was really kind of fun. It's a very stable piece of work, for which we have to thank all of the contributors to the project. Munki is and remains a labor of love. It is, of course, a time saver for many admins, but there are still a lot of people who program that environment for you. If you happen to meet anybody, is anybody in the room here someone who is committed to the Munki the Munki project as a whole? You actually made a commit? Hey, that's typo fixes matter, my friend. So thank you. If you meet somebody who has committed to the Munki project, buy them lunch, please. If they want beer, let them have a beer. But Munki manages around 500 of our Macs across our client base. That's about 90% of our fleet that we support. We started using Munki for deployment back in 2013 at one client. That original Munki instance still exists. Since then, we've done more than 30 Munki installs for groups as small as a single user or as many as 150 across multiple sites. And every Munki install that we've done in the last 2 years has largely been in a product of Munki in a box. That doesn't mean they were always done right the first time. And some of the choices that we've made have influenced choices that have been made in Munki in a box overall. For example, earlier this year, we released a new version that makes overrides for the default recipes as part of the process and uses those overrides from the get-go. So, before we dive into my storied career of mistakes, I want to talk a little bit about why mistakes matter. My life, in addition to serving as warning for others, making mistakes as a whole is a really important concept for IT to embrace and understand and deal with. We're going to make mistakes in our day-to-day lives. We're going to make mistakes that affect our fleets. We need to be able to process the information that we learn from those mistakes and apply them into fixes for those mistakes. Without mistakes, you don't innovate, you don't stretch yourself, you don't grow, and you don't learn. Mistakes are a big part of what define our growth paths. For example, a large enough mistake and you may not have one. But don't ever stop making those mistakes. Don't ever stop taking those risks or think that you're too important to try something where you can make a mistake. I recently spent some quality time learning something new for the first time. And it was an incredibly daunting experience because, so I have a music degree. I have a degree in vocal performance. And I spent some time learning chords on a ukulele. And spending time actually sounding terrible was the world's hardest thing to do for my psyche until I got it right again. And so until you actually pour that time and effort into doing something and learning something and experiencing something for the first time, you really can oftentimes lose the ball a little bit and get afraid and get discouraged by something that doesn't come to you immediately. Persevere. If you stop daring, you stop growing. And while there are some people who want at some point in their career to just stop and just be like, I have learned all that I want to learn about this thing, I feel that is counterproductive to working in teams, and I definitely feel that is counterproductive to working in careers. I certainly don't enjoy working with people who have decided that they don't need to know any more than they already do. That can be a frustrating spot. Nobody says you have to move fast and break things, Facebook. But if you're not moving or testing the edges of your knowledge, you should be. Try not to have terrible consequences, of course. You may not want to live the YOLO life entirely, but you should actually be thinking through your actions and actually starting to make your environment better. So the first thing I actually want to talk about isn't Munki at all, it's the concept of change management. Thinking carefully about fleet-wide decisions is a challenge that every IT department or consultant has, whether they want it or not. You can go that YOLO life and test your code in production, but that doesn't always have the best results for your environment. If you can develop change management that is reviewed by others, or even just give yourself some time to think about the changes that you're making before leaping into a solution, you can reap the benefits of this process. Peer review is marvelous. It is really helpful for finding flaws in the methodologies that you're using as you go forward. Keep in mind, I love the concept of change management, and I spend a lot of time thinking about how we actually deploy systems and how we fix problems. I don't have time always to put every change through change management. You may not either. Sometimes you do have to YOLO it. So the question that I have about about change management that's important is, do you really want to have to touch every machine in your fleet if you break something? The answer to that is not without a really good reason. And so this is why you test. If you've got a test machine and you make a mistake, fixes are trivial at best and a mild inconvenience at worst. I mean, you take a VM, you make your changes, you make your tests, you make sure that they work. If you blow up the VM, you revert to the snapshot and you're back where you were. If you do that with your entire fleet and you suddenly have to re-image your entire fleet, that can be a really damaging process. So people are counting on you to make their environments work and work well, so obviously change management is a huge part of your life cycle. Mostly because once upon a time, before I learned that lesson, we had a client with 40 machines and a central Munki server. I thought I was being clever, and I was going to push a payload-free package to update a few of their settings. Hilarity ensued because the machines stopped checking into the locally created server. All of them. This necessitated a round-robin visit to every machine in their environment, taking hours of time that we couldn't bill for. And that's when I got really serious about the way that we set up our Munki environments and about change management for those environments. We can talk about some best bets for some change management profiles. I'm not suggesting that you have to use Profile Manager. I'm not even suggesting that you use Profile Manager for much of anything. I am going to tell you that it's the reference installation for the MDM specification, and that you can use something like Profile Manager to do confirmation and fixability testing for profiles that you're deploying internally so that you're not testing that on your production MDM necessarily. It also gives you options for out-of-band management so that if you are changing things via packages, you're unlikely, I won't say it's impossible, but you are not going to break that MDM relationship without a lot of really, really good mistakes. If you do have to script a task that you're working on, make sure that that script fails safely and that it fails and returns the old values. And that if that change that is successful, that you have some notification method for that change. We'll talk a little bit more about a good way to do that in a little bit. In addition to MDMs, there are obviously configuration managers like Puppet and Chef. They have some huge advantages with regard to fleet management. Revisions to individual preferences are more straightforward to remedy in the future. Obviously, these are also things that can be stored in source control so that you can roll backwards if you have to. And again, you get that out-of-band management, that you're not managing the Mac with Munki, the tool that you are also updating at the same time. Changing your Munki settings with Munki is a really great way to potentially have to touch every machine in your fleet. And again, if you do have to script it, make sure that script fails safely. And it's important to test early and test often. If you're not testing with virtual machines, now's a really great time to start. You should be testing your common cases at a bare minimum, and you should be testing your edge cases to know where they exist. Testing is how you make sure it's not going to massively fail in a way that you are able to predict ahead of time, ahead of that deployment. It's straightforward enough to make a test lab out of virtual machines that support your various configurations. You can now test devices that are actually enrolled in DEP as well, so that you can actually test your dep workflow and your dep use of Munki in general. Especially if your MDM supports the concept of install application. Simple MDM does, micro MDM does, some others do as well. AirWatch, thank you Eric Gomez, wherever you are, it will also support this. And so you can sign your Munki tools, issue them up through the cloud, deliver that along with a profile full of your individual settings, and you have a first boot workflow for your Munki setup without spending a huge amount of time or effort. Don't limit your testing just to virtual machines though. Try your test out on hardware that matches the majority of your fleet. Testing in virtual machines is great, but it will not help you identify hardware-specific issues. For example, if you are potentially like me, and maybe you're making an assumption that EN0 is the wireless interface, when it may not, in fact, be if you have some older Macs, where EN0 is actually the hardwired built-in Ethernet port. So don't limit your testing, especially for network interfaces and things along those lines that are dependent upon dealing with the rest of your environment. The nice thing about testing in VMs is that it's largely just like using a wired-in Mac. But it can be hard to make the case for additional hardware for use for testing. And sometimes you may not get that luxury. But if you don't test at all, you cannot protect your people. Source control for Munki repositories can be a lot of work. But if you have a sizable fleet, it can also help you avoid career-ending mistakes. You can use a private repo on GitHub if you have to. That's a halfway decent place to start. And there are whole articles on doing this process. And we'll talk a little bit more about specific ways in which I have done this recently. And if your repo is large and the stakes are high, you can definitely save yourself substantially by putting everything that you've got into source control. There are a couple of links that will be in the speaker's notes that will be distributed with these slides for posts from Graham Pugh, AFP 548, and the actual Munki with Git documentation that is included in the Munki wiki that is part of the GitHub project page. Moving to source control for your Munki environment is going to put a lot of strictures on changes to your environments. But moving away from the YOLO life should be a theme as we talk through a lot of these problems that we've worked through. As a consultant, we spend a lot of time addressing problems and doing the day-to-day scut work of IT. A lot of our clients are small, and a lot of them don't have a lot in the way of resources. Source control can be a challenge of its own to implement as well, and you have your work cut out for you. I have some ideas, especially for those of you who do support small departments that don't have a lot in the way of resources. And now it's time for my parade of mistakes. And how I fixed them. I'm not just going to show you how once upon a time I was an idiot and then I got better. I may still be an idiot. It's a constant recovery process, right? Some of these problems aren't full-on mistakes, but the best practice may have changed since we did it initially, or the use case of the installation may have changed, and thus we needed to prepare ourselves as we move forward. The result is still the same. I have to fix something in a fleet-deployed environment without upsetting the apple cart. Some changes are easy, some changes are hard. Here is how I dealt with them. Yes, I deployed an HTTP-only Munki server. Shame. However, in my defense, why'd we do it? Simplicity. Hardwired network, lab machines that never left the building, no services available from the outside. This was really easy to set up. It probably shaved a whole 30 seconds off of my deployment time. It is not hard to get a commercial CA, or to get a commercial cert, or a certificate that is signed by your internal CA that is already trusted on these machines. It is also pretty straightforward to get yourself a Let's Encrypt certificate, and there are whole diagrams and walkthroughs that will take you through that process. If you have to, trust the certificate individually as part of your configurations management process. You want to make sure that you are communicating securely with your Munki repo. And then in this particular case, you go through the process, get a cert, trust the cert, change the endpoint. So we called this a pretty easy fix at this point. It was a fairly highly important fix. Who can tell me why, he says, reaching for the box, using an HTTP-only Munki repo would be a terrible idea?
Potential for man-in-the-middle attacks to impersonate your Munki repo and send you arbitrary packages and scripts.
Correct. Who here thinks that's a really terrible thing that could happen to your environment? That's a really bad day for everybody involved. When somebody else is now distributing your software for you, and you don't have any control over who that is, or any identification control on your individual workstations, you're going to have a bad day. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be in a month, but it might be soon, and for the rest of your very short job. And so in this particular case, what we did was we went and installed a HTTPS cert on the server, tested it to make sure that it worked in production, provided the changes necessary at the client side to do that, either through a trust relationship or through through using a certificate that was trusted from the get-go, and then we changed the endpoint to make the thing happen. So again, if you're thinking about Munki as a service that is internal to your organization only, you have to think about the time when that will change. Why not set it up right the first time, grant yourself some extra leeway so that, because I mean, that's the other thing, your machines as Munki devices, if they get out into the wild and you're only using HTTP, are still calling home once an hour, whether you want them to or not. And somebody between you and them might see that request and say, interesting. Because there's no SSL certificate on the connection, you have no way of making sure that who you're checking into is who you're supposed to be checking into. If you're planning basic auth is another way to hand yourself around this, so are client certificates. There's no reason that you shouldn't actually have to deal with a lot of this. So, I mean, the question that you have to decide is, do I really need security for my fleet? And the answer that I have to that is, how much do you like working where you work? You can do anything you want on your last day. So one of the other important things to think about is that you're not just distributing software to machines, you may be distributing keys, license keys. You may be distributing licensing packages. You may, have you actually read the licensing agreements for all of that software? Are you allowed to just have that out on the open internet for anybody else to go grab? That might be a problem. Lawyers are bad. Don't mess with lawyers, especially your lawyers. Are you distributing organizational data or configurations? You absolutely need to secure your repository. HTTPS is a good first step. Adding basic auth or client certificates to that is a huge step forward. Once upon a time, we installed a Munki environment that had one manifest, site default. Site default is a really wonderful way of making sure that all of the machines get a very bare minimum. So why'd we do it? It was a lab build-out, and it expanded outside the lab. So how do you expand from just using site default? So if you're not setting a client identifier, your Munki installation is going to try one of 4 different things. It's going to try its fully qualified domain name, it's going to try its short domain name, it's going to try the machine serial number, or it's going to try site default. And so if you've skipped a few steps along the way and you're like, let's just get this out the door and we'll build it into production later, I tend to gravitate toward using serial number because, again, it's one step up the chain from site default, and it allows you to do some interesting things. There are some really good guides out there for how you determine what the bare minimum manifest needs to be for a Munki environment. Both Victor and Alan have done a lot of thinking on this, and they've laid out their arguments quite convincingly. They're 2 strong viewpoints that you won't get confused reading. They have multiple approaches to this based on whether or not you've already trod the garden path away from site default, as well as using Munki WebAdmin with serial number-based manifests in a clear and sane way. We've also done single catalog. Again, catalogs are collections of software, and so, I mean, what are some catalogs that you might have in your environment? I have out of the box testing and production. What if I only had production? So you can see that the importance on this one really matters, especially for those of you who have already adopted auto package into your work environment. Living a YOLO life might be something you need to do if updates carry more priority in your organization than the possible pitfalls of those updates. But you have to think about yourself and say, you have to think, am I actually testing this in my IT department environment? Am I actually going to a workstation and making sure that Firefox launches when they update it tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day before I put it into production? Are you doing that now? Some people are, some people aren't. Some people are saying, I need a 9-day window after an update has been received so that we can put it through proper QA and make sure that we actually deliver to people the final working software that they have. What's your workload? Do you have somebody in your environment that's a dedicated QA? I have 2 people, and we support 600 people. We support 50 different environments. We don't have a dedicated QA. This machine is part of my testing catalog. Therefore, I dog food all of the releases before they actually get put out into the field. And for several of our clients who have very sensitive workflows, we do monthly pushes from testing into production. But that takes us back to a really important concept. How do you test the software that you have? And what it came down to internally for us, what we realized was that one test installation is not significant enough to tell you where the problems are. You need multiple people testing your software. That can be a subset of your catalog, a subset of your groups of users. And so at that point, you should also never have someone whose application scope is limited in the test group. So essentially, if you have one person and all they do is Word, you don't want them being part of your test group for Excel. They're never going to open Excel. Or they might test Excel by opening Excel and then quitting, which is usually what I do with Excel simply because spreadsheets scare me. You also want to make sure that the person who is your tester in this environment is never someone whose work is indispensable. Now, you get to decide with your client whose work is indispensable. I have a couple of people in an organization that we work with that we definitely consider to be indispensable. They were not necessarily the people that were identified by the internal IT department as being indispensable. So you're going to have different opinions of who is an indispensable person to make sure that you're not doing anything to their machine that will cause them to be not productive any longer. And it's really, really important that you are not just doing IT department only testing. We have a mindset. It is different than the mindset of our users. I have a user who I care about a great deal, who sees the world in a very different way than I do. And I think that I've QA'd this form application that we use, and I go through and I would be like, okay, so if I want to increase the ticket counts for this section, I go and increase the ticket counts, and I'm tinkering away through on their workflow, and I don't find the bugs that I can't see. Seth sits down at the workstation, he pushes 2 buttons, and it's broken. So find someone who is adept at finding your problems. The other important thing to do is make good tests. Launching the application and having it not crash is not a good test. Okay, I'll take that back. It's a test. It is not a great test. That's clearly a showstopper, but it's maybe not that simplistic. And so if you're in education, you create a rubric, right? How many education users in the house? Several. So who here knows what a rubric is? You actually spend time and you examine what you have and you match it against certain criteria, and that decides whether or not the thing is good or whether it needs remediation. So you pick some critical tests that your primary applications must pass and evaluate them against that. A browser, for example, it's got to load organizational critical websites. If you're an Okta shop, you have to be able to load Okta. It has to work. If you're in an organization where you're distributing Flash, the Flash plugin's got to work, especially if that's part of a mission-critical resource. We have one client whose billing system requires Silverlight. You can see where that problem happened. And all of a sudden, we couldn't load anything anywhere. I never would have found that. Cliff found that for us. For the Office suite, pick a clear set of documents that your organization uses often. Make a copy, test updates to these documents, save them, distribute them to another workstation, and make sure they still open on the old version. Print something. For the love of God, print something. For Creative Cloud, these are the hardest work of our workflows to test because I'm not a graphic designer. I can make the pretty boxes smaller and maybe bigger, and sometimes I can make them do awful things. I'm not a graphic designer. You're going to need to borrow one to test your environment. Work with a designer to build the rubric of tasks for your workflows for Creative Cloud. Cover that printing process, cover any third-party tools that you are dependent upon, and make sure that everything works flawlessly before you deploy it to everybody. Because if you don't, Shirley will find you. I love Shirley. Shirley is I asked Shirley if she could be in this presentation, and she was like, oh, I don't want to yell at anybody. And I was like, Shirley, have you ever had somebody who updated your machine and it broke everything? Yes. And then she picked up the ruler. So vet the tools carefully. Don't mess it up, because Shirley will find you. And it's the nice ones you have to worry about. So improper DNS and switching servers. Who here remembers the monkey bars? I remember the monkey bars. Swing from one ring to another, and you positively make sure that you had enough momentum to make it from that first rung to that next rung. And when you're a little kid, those rungs feel like they're about 20 feet apart. Because if you fell into the tan bark or you fell into the asphalt, and that hurt. Tan bark was brutal, though. I mean, sharp corners. It was itchy if it got up under your shirt. But I suppose it was better than falling 5 feet on asphalt, so I guess there's that. The crazy things they let you do as kids, right? All of that serves to say you don't want to have your users fall down into the tan bark as you shift between configurations. I've done this wrong. It was a huge pain, and I'm here primarily to provide you with some good guidelines for how to prepare yourself for this move. This one is really important. Use a per service, fully qualified domain name for your services. Because if you don't, you find yourself in my situation. Client was 20 people. They had one server. It did everything. Everything was pointed at server.domain.com, which was great because there was only server.domain.com. Munki was the secondary service, and it outgrew the wiki server that was stored on that box. As a result, I can't change the host name of the wiki server without, well, we tested that. That did not go well at all. It was the OD master and then the wiki server, and they customized their wiki server. Don't let them do that. Very bad. Time machine required. And essentially, it became the center of their environment, and there was no failover, and there were all sorts of problems. And so we finally had permission to start to migrate away things and realized that we were stuck. We couldn't just change the DNS for server.navantigroup.com to monkey.navantigroup.com without changing the fully qualified domain name of the primary server. Too many things relied on the old server domain. If we'd only used a service record for monkey.domainname.com, we could move the repository to the new Apache or Nginx container, switch the service record, and continue about with our lives, living lives of distinction. We didn't do that. So we had to change the software repo URL on all of our clients to get them across the gap. So how did we choose to get there? This client has chosen not to opt into MDM management, which is the polite way of saying they've decided it's too expensive. So we couldn't just push a profile. We opted to write a tool to do it for us. Since we were just moving the repository to a new home and changing the URL, we only needed to alter a single setting, software repo URL. But how do we make sure this works? Because we don't want to touch anything. We just want to put this into Munki, have it distribute, and have the device check in on the new server. So we thought about it generating a notifications file someplace either on the server or on the client that we could watch for, but that sounded frustrating to check. We thought about it generating a service email, but that even sounded tedious. I hate email. I get so much email. It sounded like a really inefficient way to use the process. What about Slack? What about Slack? And so what we did was we wrote a script that would check the Munki preferences for a specific key, exit normally if it was set correctly, but if it wasn't set correctly, it would make the change that we were looking for and use a Slack webhook to tell it that everything had gone okay after the fact. Then we could verify with Munki report or through log analysis that everything had gone correctly. So this is that script. And you can see the gist link at the bottom. Again, it'll all be in the slides, which will be posted on the web. But you can essentially see, hey, look, we've got a channel, we've got a username, this is a client update from the identity of the machine itself. I've updated the pref to check to should be successfully. Done. This is what it looks like in production. So again, you want to make sure that you have verifiable changes. make sure that your changes, make sure when you're writing scripts to change settings, make sure you get a verification that the change completes on a given host and point us to that record. Compare that to a list of clients using something verifiable. If you're using Munki Report or something similar, you can view the error logs of a given environment to make sure that machines aren't still checking in on the old server, and then reissue those scripts as necessary, either through an on-demand task or something along those lines. When you write a process like this to move between two host environments, make sure you get everyone. But really, you need a configuration manager. These scripts and hoops that we all just jumped through are the sort of things that are only necessary when you've decided to ignore what Apple has given you in the MDM specification and what other larger organizations have been giving you for some time longer. Configuration management that is verifiable and auditable. Puppet, Chef, these are the kind of professional tools that get used in large fleets for a reason. You want to make sure that your changes get made across a fleet at the size of Google's or Facebook's. There's no reason that you can't do that for a fleet of 50 or 100. It's just more work, but it's all more work. Better busy than bored. So change management is your friend. And really what I mean is source control is your friend. This part feels scary. It feels daunting. It can feel troubling. It can feel like nothing you're doing is actually saving you time. Much like anything else, it's about getting through the awkward moments of early discovery and work yourself into a pattern. Learn by breaking things. Learn by fixing what you've broken. Don't just learn in production if you can avoid it. So Git. This is Git. It tracks a collaborative work on projects through a beautiful distributed graph theory tree model. Cool. How do we use it? No idea. Just memorize these shell commands and type them to sync up. If you get errors, save your work elsewhere, delete the project, and download a fresh copy. This is not wrong. You don't have to understand every part of Git to make sure that your environment is properly protected. It helps. Don't get me wrong, it helps. But it's also interesting to think about, to make sure that your commits make sense as you go through them. Because I don't know, I mean, you can go and look at the commit history for Munki in a Box. It's public. You can see when I've essentially gotten to the hands section of, I have made my 5th commit in the last, 2 minutes. And it's just, how many times do they just say like bug fixes, right? So when we developed our internal auto package workflow for updating the Munki repo that we were using as our master, we wrote a script because we wanted to differentiate between commits that were made by robots and commits that were made by people. And so we wanted the commit made after the robot has run, right? Because we want to capture that as it happens. And so we wrote a script. Just another fine automated commit message made by robots on date and time. And essentially at that point, it changes the location of the Munki repo on our master, Git adds the entire repo, commits the thing, and we get the actual message. There's probably a better way to script this. Come see me after and tell me what it is, because I will learn from my mistake. The other thing that's important to think about with source control is that you're probably going to want to split your repo. You're probably going to want to split up your source control into things that you actually care about versus things that are either large binary objects or get regenerated all the time. And because, for example, your source control for your Munki, for manifests and package info, this is on a fairly large server, is about 600 kilobytes. That's an easily syncable object. That's very quick to push up to the cloud. The collection of packages, icons, and catalogs, however, where catalogs at this point are more about regenerating on individual service nodes than you are about actually pulling other things there. For those of you, I'm going to put a quick plug for Friday morning session by Rick Heil on moving your Munki to the cloud. I'm going to touch on this briefly. He's already done it. He has more than one machine in production. He has several hundred. I have one. So be aware. But yeah, you don't want to be syncing a 25 gigabyte Git file up to your Git. Even if you're using Git LFS, this can be a bit of an adventure. But now what? Your repo's in source control. Way to go! Now what do I do with it? Great question. Let's talk about the mistakes I'm making right now. So a couple weeks ago, I started looking at what it would take to actually have a working Munki environment that we would audit entirely, because right now we're using a third-party service that was geared toward the Mac for a very long time, up until they got bought twice in 6 months. And their team was great at the time, and they moved the guy who was really, really good at making sure stuff happened into like a product manager role, and they got rid of those support guys that we really liked. And it stopped being a good value prop for us, for those 1 and 2 and 5 person companies. We're paying them this money. It's not a lot of money, but couldn't we do it cheaper if we did it better in-house? Couldn't we make that be something that is something that we can benefit from? And so we started thinking about what would it take to actually have a Munki server that was centralized for these different clients that don't need an on-site Munki server because there's only 5 of them, or there's 15 of them and they've got a really kick-ass internet connection. So we don't need to worry about them downloading a bunch of stuff on the internet over and over and over again. And so we started thinking about S3 and CloudFront. Now, S3 and CloudFront do require a middleware function, and there's a whole section of the Munki wiki that talks about how middleware objects work, and there are now file system plugins in Munki 3 for different cloud providers. And that's a lot of reading, and I strongly suggest you do it, and ask me questions in like 3 or 4 months when I've actually finished understanding everything I've started to process now. So we had to think about what would it take to actually do this for our smaller clients. We don't just have to change their configuration. We have to actually provide them additional data. And so using the CloudFront middleware involves us installing a signing key from an Amazon account in /user local Munki. We have to install the cloudfront.py script into user local Munki. We have to assign preferences with our access key to the middleware itself, and we have to change the endpoint URL to CloudFront. And Aaron Birchfield, who I believe is at Yelp, I think, made public the repository that he is using for cloud-fronted Munki, or middleware for this. And so what our workflow looks like now is that we are managing a Munki repo on our admin machine. That's where Autopackager hangs out. That is where we are doing our Munki admin manifest administration. And that machine is sitting at my house because we don't have an office, and therefore it's my house. We got a really nice internet connection. RCN was polite enough to provide us with a gig down and 25 up, which is enough for us to serve a couple 2 or 3 person shops on a regular basis without it starting to raise any flags at RCN that I might be running a large distribution network out of my home internet connection against their rules. Essentially what we do at that point is that we put our manifest and package info files into source control. We use Autopackage to keep updates moving. We sync the entire repository, catalogs and all, to S3, to an S3 bucket. And then we use CloudFront to distribute the S3 bucket to trusted clients. That's what that signing key is for. I don't need to worry about HTTP basic auth anymore because I'm doing it wrapped in the signed requests for the files. You can also set this up so that requester pays. And so essentially you could require that your client, or you could help them set up a AWS account on their own, and essentially at that point they get charged for their own bandwidth. Now, I don't think that this is essentially what it looks like from a schematic perspective. Internet clients hang out there. They talk to CloudFront with the monkey-access.pem file and the CloudFront middleware. I talk to the S3 bucket, and I let CloudFront and S3 talk to each other. The admin at Mac Mini is running Autopackager and Munki admin, and then communicating the changes into GitLab. This would also let us do commits to that repo from here, and then let those sync back and forth through a get, pull, and push process. For those of you who are working with more than just one Munki administrator, this is a great way to make sure that you have accountability for changes that get made to your environment. So that if you have 5 different people with access to your GitLab project, they pull down any changes, they make changes of their own, they push them back to the server, and then those get pushed out into production. There's also a great way to do this, and this is why I really think you need to go see Rick's talk, is that he's actually got it working with Nginx proxy servers in their individual offices so that their proxies manage to capture the individual updates so you don't have to download them all from CloudFront, you just have to get it once. And then you're saving a bunch of money on transit, and you're saving a bunch of functionality that hangs out on this side of things. So this probably isn't the best way to do it, but it's the way that I figured out how to do it for now. And I'm sure there are plenty of mistakes in this architecture. It's been really solid for the first couple of days. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the cost would be. Again, we moved a 25 gigabyte repository up, a 660 kilobyte object up to CloudFront, and this machine has been checking in every 15 minutes since then. And we set up the repo. I think the repo went live on July 6th. Today is the 12th. And in the meantime, I have spent a grand total of 9 cents on one client, and that includes the initial push of the data into S3. So in terms of like, do I have to worry about this being expensive? Not yet. Is this going to hang on? Is this going to scale well? Well, we're going to find out. Some of this is just figuring out where the problems are in this workflow. I can already see a couple, and I figure I'll talk about those for a half second. You can only have one set of CloudFront signing keys, or 2 sets of CloudFront signing keys for your entire organization. That's not great. And so if you're going to want to set this up for individual sub-clients, or if you've got departments that are paying for their own AWS and they want requester pays, we got to figure out how that's going to work. Because you can say that other departments are going to have access to your S3 bucket or to your CloudFront instance, but then they're going to have to bring their own keys, and you're going to have to figure out how to provision them. And so it's going to be a learning process as we figure out how this process shakes out. I mean, the other alternative is that you just say, hey, we're just going to open this up to the public. Don't do that. Please don't do that. We already talked about that. That was HTTP basic. Don't do that. Because that was an option, and I flirted with it for about 30 seconds. And then I remembered lawyers, and I got really afraid, and I cried. And I felt better, and then I just put the signing key in place. I was afraid that that was going to take a huge amount of engineering time to do all of this process. The total elapsed time to put our primary Munki repo into source control and into AWS was under 5 hours. I did it on a Friday night. I may have had a beverage or two. So it is not a huge amount of expenditure of time to get yourself into source control, to get yourself using source control in a sane way, and then moving your infrastructure out to people whose job it is to manage infrastructure. Now, your job may be to manage infrastructure, in which case, if you've got a really great environment, if you've got your own CDN, I see John in the room. If you do need a CDN, talk to John. He can help with that, or his company can. There are many ways to this same path. What you're after is a way in which you can put your repository into a safe place so that only the good people actually get to write to it, and so that you have a bunch of users that can read from it in a sane way. And you want to make sure that you've actually got other things. So I kind of want to sum up a few things. And if you take away nothing else from my talk, you need a change management system. It can be an MDM, it can be Chef, it can be Puppet, it can be anything, but you need one. Because if you're making changes in such a way that they're out of band, if you're trying to change the configuration of your machine with the tool you're about to change, bad days. Separate that role. I'm using simple MDM to push out my Munki profile to all of our clients. If you have access to update.technolutionary.com, you got that information from a profile that came from simple MDM. Simple MDM is not expensive. It's $30 per device per year. If you have more than 500 devices, that price does go down. It's actually cheaper to buy. If you have 400 devices, you can buy 500 and grow into it, and you're still saving yourself money. So having an MDM that can manage that for you is incredibly helpful, especially one that can understand arbitrary preference domains, like the managed installs plist file. Without your change management, in the event that you don't have change management, make sure that you write a script that will get you from point A to point B without leaving your client someplace in the middle. Having sane defaults checked so that you can essentially go through that process and say, is this set right? No. Set it correctly? Okay, do another check to make sure that it's still set correctly. And you may have to watch out if you're already managing things via profile or you're managing things via multiple methods. There are places that Munki files will hide. If you had a particularly security conscious person who was running your Munki environment and you've changed the /library/preferences/manage installs.plist file and your changes are not being honored, why might that be? Because the one for var/var.root might also have values that are taken into effect. And it was really funny. I was trying to get the machine to check in, and I wasn't seeing check-ins happen. And I was really ticked off at myself because I was like, if I look at the managed installs file, everything looks right. What am I missing? I was missing the MDM provided profile that was telling me to check in on the master server and not on the new cloud server. So you do have to watch that you're checking in the right place. Use service-based DNS everywhere. If you're not using a record that is only tied to your Munki environment, not to the host on which it runs, now would be a great time to fix that before you outgrow that hardware and need a new name. Also, never leap without a plan. Spend a lot of time planning and testing how you're going to get from one configuration environment to another configuration environment. Use Munki's features as much as you can to do this, but be aware that that is out there. And lastly, if you're not exploring, you're not learning. And so you should have a test Munki environment that is just yours to blow away and destroy as you will. It should also be in its own source control so that you can do those kind of things. You can also use things like CI, continuous integration, to actually pull down changes from your repo, so that if you've got a CI environment or a GitLab hosted environment, you can use the CI workers to actually go and pull that copy to your test repo before it's done. Or when you've made a change to your test repo and committed it to production, production goes and grabs that repo and keeps itself up to date. Use the tools that you have available to you. So with all of that, I'm going to open things up to questions, and please remember that statements are not questions. So, who wants to ask me about where I screwed up now? I'm not going to throw it hard, guys. Anybody? All right, Pat or Mr. Mian? Oh. Only off by 2. Not an off by 1 problem. All right.
We won't include that in the list of mistakes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for not holding that against me.
At the beginning, you mentioned creating separate DNS records. You mentioned service records. Are you recommending CNAMEs versus host names? Anything in particular? Do you have a convention? I like CNAMEs because you can move them around easily, and you can always do it with A records. It's just one more thing you have to keep track of. If you're moving things to CloudFront, you're probably going to be using a CNAME anyway, so why not start now? Thank you.
Oh, Dennis behind you.
Again, I want to thank you for Munki in a Box.
Oh.
It has helped me deploy Munki forever.
You're welcome. I'm officially out of features to add, so if folks want to create issues with ideas for things that might belong there, this would be a great time to do that.
One of the wonderful things about it is you can deploy it and get it up very quickly. Adding authentication is kind of an extra step, and I assume it's kind of been an exercise left to the reader to this point. Is there any plan to integrate a nice workflow or set of steps?
Since release 1.5, HTTP basic auth is included in the script.
Okay.
So if you just want HTTPS plus HTTP basic auth, that's in there. Really important thing, change the default password that's listed as change me. This has tripped some people up, so I just want to make sure that if you do that, you actually use you change the password that's stored there. But then it will generate it'll generate the hash for you and put that in the client installer that is generated as part of that script. So when you run the script and it creates the Munki repo for the first time, it will create the HT access files for you to make sure that it's basic auth requiring, and then it will update the client installer package script that you actually run on the client to make sure that it knows how to actually call home. If that doesn't work, I want to know, but it does work in my test environment. So if there's something else that's affecting that I haven't accounted for, I'd love to know.
Cool.
I was also thinking that maybe for 2.0, it might make sense to use something like Caddy as the server and abstract it entirely from the macOS server application. Because right now it does require macOS server, which I like just fine despite its negative reputation in the field. It's a tolerable web server. It does what it says on the tin. But some other people might like a more Linux-focused version of Munki in the box, even if it's still running on a Mac.
Cool.
Across the way. Be brave, people. There you go.
All right, you had mentioned in your QA testing having a QA testing rubric for each app.
Yes.
Do you have those online somewhere?
They are the property of my clients.
Okay.
In most ways. I will encourage you to think about it as what can I live with? What do I have to make sure works outside of the box? And essentially, you've got to set up, you're going to have some give and take with those. Mm-hmm. There's going to be points of no return. There are going to be clear crash points where essentially if the app doesn't launch, don't deploy it. If the app does not function in your environment, don't deploy it. If there are specific tasks that users need to accomplish using those applications, list those and treat them as test cases. Mm-hmm. And so building a rubric is just about establishing a clear set of goals for what this software has to do if it needs to be deployed in your environment. Mm-hmm. And recognize that security has to play into that. Because if I have an app that does all of the tasks that I need it to do, but also spends its quality time phoning home to Eastern Europe, maybe don't install it. So, I mean, that's going to be a balance that you have to strike within your organization, and I can't make that choice for you, unfortunately.
Right, but there are going to be some common apps that we all use, like previously Text Wrangler or BB Edit. There should be that should be something that would be very easily shareable, or at least start with a baseline for like, okay, Microsoft Word. What do you want to check with Microsoft Word when you do an update with that?
Sure. And from my perspective. In a lot of cases does it load the fonts that we need, mm-hmm. Which isn't necessarily a Word problem, but does it display them correctly in the menus? Do we maybe need to think about adding a dump of the font caches when installing mm-hmm. this? Because those are optional tasks that you can provide on the back end. But yeah, I haven't published those simply because they're their rubrics. We just help them write them down. So, I mean, I'd be happy to spend the afternoon, a little bit of time after we're done here, writing one up for something like Text Wrangler or Word and releasing it, though. I can do that. That's doable. Thanks. Yeah. Other questions and concerns? Oh, Sammer? Nice catch.
So you said you use serial number-based manifests?
Yes.
How are you generating those?
Sure. So when we pick up an environment, one of the things that we do is we install a site default manifest that includes our reporting tools. And essentially everything picks up the reporting tools first and does check in with the site default manifest first. And I get a list of serial numbers, which then I create one manifest based on that essentially includes the right groups. And Ditto's your friend, as it turns out. And step through a script. And if you're not scripting the creation of those manifests, you should be.
So why would you do that instead of have a single manifest per environment or per
Right.
set of?
So because at least in our experience, we've had situations where a individual member of a team needs something that's not given to every other member of that team, either because it's a really pricey piece of software they only paid for one seat of, and then I don't want to install it everywhere. I just want to take that one manifest, and sure, I'll have individual manifest for organization, department, sub-department, and then their individual machine. That machine manifest can contain those other three manifests. And so essentially it'll go and get site default, and then it will get department, and then it will go and get sub-department. But then for this one over here, this one special package, I want to be able to throw that package just on that machine. And so I'll put that in the installed items of just that serial number manifest and walk away with it that way. And essentially, it's more flexible at that point. Because, I mean, you're still controlling what's being installed on all of the machines through the site default catalog. You're controlling what gets installed on all of a department's machines from the department catalog, and then all of the sub-department machines from the sub-department manifest. Sorry, I used catalog when I should have used manifest several times there. Another mistake. And essentially using those manifests together as, you know, contained items. And then for anything that just gets installed on one machine, now I have the flexibility to do that.
We use a pre-flight script that checks the IP address of the machine
Sure.
against a location and then sets a client ID based on the location.
Yep.
Any pitfalls you see with something like that?
Only insofar as if the software list is different. You're not going to see anything removed, you know, from a machine at that point, but if the manifests aren't in sync between regions, you may run into trouble. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point, is that
Right.
each region gets different sets of
Yeah,
things.
and I was going to say, well, I mean, what's the case for a traveling user at that point? If
Well, when we set this up, there was no traveling user. It's all it's all iMac. So unless
Right,
they're
yeah.
picking up a 27-inch iMac and taking
well,
it
I mean,
with them.
you know, you got mobile labs that go places. That may be something that you need to take into account. But I mean, that's the only pitfall that I can think of at that point, is that you're locking down what goes where by where the machine physically is. That may make sense if you've got sites in China where a bunch of the software just isn't licensable or isn't to be used there for export regions or for export reasons or things along all those lines. That makes a lot of sense at that point. And so you're kind of balancing your needs and your wants at that point. Couple questions are up front here. Yehuda.
We have, let's say, teacher computers and student computers, and a pool of spares for when they break
Sure.
their computers. What would the best way to manage those spares using Munki?
That's a really great question. Serial number manifests are actually a really great way to do that at that point, because you have something that's getting a spare manifest because its serial number contains this. I mean, the serial number manifest contains the spares manifest, which could just be site default. So anything that you can freely deploy. And then at that point, if you've got a machine that you want to move to a student, you just change the manifest identifier and have it check in again. And at that point, it will bring itself back to where it needs to be. Now, the only thing to recognize as part of that is if there's anything in your spares pool that students can't have, then you would need to put that in the managed uninstalls section. So that is something that you might want to consider. But at that point, what you do is you've got a device that's hanging out in the spares pool. It's, you know, waking up once a night just to make sure it's checking in, it's getting its software updates as necessary. And then you get in the office at 9 a.m., student has broken their computer, you pull it open, you get the serial number off of the thing, you put that on a big label on the back of the thing, you go and alter the manifest so that it's now a student machine, wake it up, run Managed Software Center, it gets the rest of the student suite, and you hand it to the student. And so, I mean, you flex back and forth that way. It's not exactly automated. There might be a way to do this through like mobile device management. For a given machine, you switch groups. In simple MDM, they're device groups, and so you can essentially say, okay, this manifest here goes, or this device here now moves into the student group, and then it pulls a manifest change automatically and goes from there.
I've been doing it with host names, where I'll change I'll add the name teacher into the spare computer's host name, or the name or the word student into it.
Sure.
And
I mean,
now it goes-
that's also possible. If you're able to change either the centralized DNS host name environment, that's a possibility too. Toward the back.
So what about using conditions in the manifests, and how often, I mean, is there kind of a limit, or?
There's a logical limit, of course. I mean, just in terms of how many cases do you have to evaluate, how much CPU time is it going to take to do a check-in? I mean, which kind of conditions are you concerned about at that point?
Host name-based ones?
Just host name-based ones?
Yeah, typically for optional installs.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely an option for that. That's
I
a
mean,
way
I'm
to put it
currently
together.
using that. I'm just wondering, is there, at some point, am I going to kind of run into a barrier or a limit because I'm trying to do?
I've really limited my use of the conditional in my Munki environment, figuring that in most of our cases, I either really want it installed or I don't care about how it's managed at all. We operate a lot of environments where some of the users are admins and they can install their own stuff. Obviously, we're moving towards a Santa world where binary whitelisting and blacklisting is a more realistic way of managing what can and can't be installed. And so you can't get your users in trouble that way. It's worth exploring. Give it a shot. See how it does.
Like I said, I'm currently using it, and it's basically installing a wireless profile and Sonos.
Okay.
Since Sonos doesn't have any native password protection, so we have them on different VLANs, and that VLAN's tagged to that wireless network. So,
Okay.
you know, only certain managers, people with laptops, can then access that wireless network and adjust the music. So, you know, like right now I have, you know, at least 5 different people that can manage it based off this condition. So I'm just
Okay.
wondering, hey, if I got to hit at some point where it's just,
The person to ask that question to is Greg. He would know better than I.
thanks.
Cool. Other questions?
When I first set up my Munki repo, I only made a couple of manifests, and I was really abstract in naming them: manifest A, manifest B, manifest C, and student. And thinking I was being very clever, I partitioned them off into sections of the school. Like all the people over here would be manifest A, and that worked really, really poorly.
Yep.
After attending your talk on Monkey in a Box back in 2014, I think, I went back in and scrapped the entire Munki repo. Nate Felden helped me out, and I created a hierarchical setup from site default all the way down, and it's just given us so much more fluidity. For example, I have every device checks in with serial number, which I scan off the barcodes on the side of the box when Apple ships them to me, because the amount of time it takes for them to be unpacked, I can scan all the barcodes and have them in Deploy Studio long before they even hit Munki.
Right.
Then the serial number is then assigned to belongs only to one manifest, the user manifest, and I only assign software to the user manifest. So that way when somebody spills coffee all over their computer, I just reassign that manifest.
Yep.
And then when we have a TEDx event at the school, I can take a couple of machines out of one manifest and put it into a special group, and they'll get software just for that event. It's really made things a lot more flexible, so thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And I was going to say, having flexibility in your manifest structure and moving your software not just into a site default catalog, or site default manifest, but into departmental manifest, role manifest, and in your case, user manifest makes all the difference in the world. Most of the time, what we're doing is departmental manifests at that point. You'll get an individual serial number that belongs to a department, which gets a software payload. But a user-based, especially if you start to run into more than one user with one special piece of software, or if you have a user that has 3 different machines because they're the CEO and are very important, you can deploy software in a much more sane fashion at that point. So, yes. Well, I mean, yeah, you can have a manifest that has other included manifests. They don't have to be fully nested. In some of our cases, they are. For example, we have an institution that gets a site default workflow, a creative workflow, and a creative extra tools workflow. The creative extra tools is just a subset, is just a superset of the creative tools. And so essentially we just say, these extra 2 things go onto those machines. And so that manifest really only has 2 items. It's Premiere and After Effects. And essentially, if you're that special person, you end up with those 2 extra applications. I don't have to include the creative manifest in that because it's just pulling that. And so you want to treat them like building blocks.
So how do you deal with updates? Let's say some computers belong to the same manifest, but you only want a few of them to get the update. You don't want all of them to get it.
Welcome to the wide world of catalogs, because you can at that point issue an update for a specific testing catalog. And so if a given machine it's receiving updates for that stream, but it's a member of the testing catalog, you can choose which software updates apply to which catalog, so that you can have a production catalog, a testing A catalog, a testing B catalog, and essentially you could do the equivalent of the slow insider, fast insider, and production releases of Office, for example. And that's a good way to handle that. So that you've got somebody who's your departmental person, they just get an extra catalog associated with their manifest. And at that point, they get the testing updates, not just the production ones. And so that's a good way to test, point releases individually, especially for people that are in your departments.
We deal with our labs. In some labs, sometimes we need to install, some teachers request an updated version of the software, right?
Yeah.
But we don't want to deploy to the whole school.
Yeah, and there's no reason that you can't have a lab manifest or a lab catalog for just that lab, so that if that department paid the extra money for the newer version of the software, you only deploy it to that, you only approve it for that catalog.
So basically what you're saying is, let's say I have my production catalog, and that's what they belong to. And then let's say the update comes up, then just create another catalog, and then point to it, I guess?
So yeah,
The
you
manifest-
add that catalog to the manifest. If they've got the same object name, if they're all, the great example is Microsoft Word, right? So we call it, Word 35 dot, whatever the build number is this week. And another build comes out tomorrow, and the lab paid for that build. And essentially, you put that into a lab catalog that's approved for the lab catalog. Any of those lab machines that get the lab catalog will retrieve the new update while other machines stay the same. And it's just what's your order of precedence in terms of catalogs at that point. And so you do have to watch what order the catalogs end up in the plist file that gets delivered to the piece. Otherwise, you may have an update that never gets applied. I think I explained that right. Yeah, that makes sense. Other questions? You guys have been awesome. Thank you so much.